Standing in my own hallway at 72 years old, clutching a bag of groceries I'd forgotten I was holding, I listened to my son Michael and his wife Janet discuss the best time to schedule my funeral. Not hypothetically, not someday in the distant future. They were talking about catering options and flower arrangements for a service they apparently expected to need very soon. The words drifted through the thin walls of the ranch house I'd called home for 43 years. The same house where I'd raised Michael as a single mother after his father died in Vietnam. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The same kitchen where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his high school graduation. Now that kitchen had become a planning committee for my departure from this world, and nobody had bothered to mention that I was supposedly dying. I set the groceries down as quietly as possible, my hands trembling not from age but from the shock of hearing my daughter-in-law say, "The funeral home suggested Tuesday morning services get better attendance. People can come before work. My name is Dorothy Chen, though most people call me Dot. I'm 72 years old, born and raised here in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the corn grows tall and neighbors still wave when they pass your house. I moved to this quiet street in 1981, when Michael was just 8 years old, determined to give him stability after losing his father. I worked double shifts at the textile factory for 15 years, then transitioned to bookkeeping for local businesses until I retired at 67. I've always been what people call sturdy, reliable, the kind of woman who shows up with casseroles when tragedy strikes and remembers everyone's birthdays. But apparently, according to the conversation happening in my kitchen, I was also dying, and my family had decided to handle the arrangements without my input. The conversation continued as I stood frozen in my own hallway, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. Janet's voice carried that particular tone she used when discussing practical matters, the same voice she'd used when suggesting I might be more comfortable in a senior community last Christmas. "I think we should keep it simple," she was saying. "Nothing too elaborate." Dot was always practical about money. Was. Past tense. As if I'd already departed this earth and taken my opinions with me. Michael's voice joined in, deeper than his father's had been, but carrying the same note of resignation that had always frustrated me about both of them. "We should probably call the church tomorrow. Father Martinez will want time to prepare something appropriate." Something appropriate, I wondered what that meant exactly. Would Father Martinez talk about my volunteer work at the food bank? Or would he focus on how I'd apparently become such a burden that my own family was eagerly planning my send-off? I'd been living with Michael and Janet for 8 months now, ever since the incident that changed everything. The incident, as they called it, though I preferred to think of it as the day I learned that falling down in your own garden apparently transforms you from an independent woman into a fragile invalid in the eyes of your adult children. The broken hip had healed completely, my doctor had cleared me for all normal activities. But somehow I'd never quite managed to convince Michael and Janet that I was still the same woman who'd raised him single-handedly and maintained this house for 4 decades. The move had been presented as temporary, just until I felt more secure living alone. But temporary had stretched into months, and now I understood why they'd been so insistent. It wasn't about my security at all. It was about their convenience. Having me under their roof made it easier to monitor my decline and plan accordingly. "What about her jewelry?" Janet's voice again, practical as always. "Some of those pieces might be worth something. We could use the money for the flowers." My jewelry, the modest collection I'd accumulated over 7 decades of life, including my mother's pearl earrings and the silver bracelet Michael had given me for my 50th birthday. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They were already dividing up my possessions like I was an estate sale waiting to happen. I thought about walking into that kitchen right then, announcing my presence and demanding an explanation. But something held me back. Some instinct that told me I needed to hear more. Needed to understand the full scope of what they were planning before I revealed my hand. "The insurance should cover most of the expenses," Michael said, and I could hear papers rustling. I found the policy in her desk drawer. $25,000, which should be more than enough for a basic service. $25,000. The life insurance policy I'd maintained faithfully for 30 years, intended to give Michael a small cushion after I was gone. They'd been through my desk, through my personal papers, cataloging my assets like accountants preparing for an audit. "What about the house?" Janet asked, and my blood turned to ice. "The real estate market is pretty good right now. This neighborhood has really improved since we moved in." Since we moved in. As if this had been their house all along. As if I'd been nothing more than a temporary occupant in the home I'd bought and paid for and loved for half my life. "We'd have to check the deed," Michael replied. "But I think it's in her name only. Should transfer to me automatically." Should transfer to me automatically. My son was discussing the inheritance of property from his very much alive mother, as if I were already 6 feet underground. The casual way he said it, the assumption that my death was not just inevitable but imminent, made my chest tight with a combination of grief and rage I'd never experienced before. I heard footsteps moving toward the hallway and quickly grabbed my groceries, stepping back outside and closing the door with enough noise to announce my return. By the time I entered the kitchen, Michael and Janet were seated at the table with what appeared to be completely innocent paperwork spread between them. "Hi, Mom," Michael said without looking up. "How was the store?" "Fine," I managed, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "Just picked up a few things." Janet glanced at me with the bright, false smile she'd perfected over the 8 months I'd been living here. "We were just paying some bills." Boring adult stuff. Boring adult stuff like planning my funeral and dividing my possessions. I nodded and began putting away groceries, my hands moving automatically while my mind raced through everything I'd just heard. The cereal went in the pantry next to the canned goods I'd organized by expiration date, a habit that had driven my late husband crazy but made perfect sense to me. The milk went in the refrigerator beside the leftover pot roast Janet had made 2 days ago, the same pot roast she'd insisted on preparing even though I'd offered to cook dinner myself. Everything in this kitchen had been rearranged, according to Janet's preferences, my familiar organization system replaced by her more modern approach to household management. "Are you feeling all right?" Janet asked, and I turned to find her studying my face with what might have been genuine concern or careful observation. "You look a little pale." Pale. I wondered if that was part of their evidence for my imminent demise, if they'd been cataloging every sign of fatigue or moment of forgetfulness as proof that I was failing faster than expected. "I'm fine," I said again, closing the refrigerator door a little harder than necessary. "Just tired. I think I'll rest for a while." "Good idea," Michael said, finally looking up from his paperwork. "You've been doing too much lately. Maybe you should take it easier tomorrow." Take it easier. As if grocery shopping and light housework were strenuous activities for someone my age. As if I hadn't spent 15 years working factory shifts that would exhaust people half my age. I retreated to what had once been Michael's childhood bedroom, now converted into my temporary quarters with furniture moved from various parts of the house. My bed, my dresser, my reading chair, all crammed into a space that felt more like storage than a home. The walls still held faint marks where Michael's baseball posters had hung, ghostly rectangles that reminded me this was meant to be temporary. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I tried to process what I'd overheard. My family, the people I'd sacrificed everything to support and nurture, were planning my funeral with the same casual efficiency they might use to organize a dinner party. They'd been through my personal papers, calculated my life insurance, and discussed my property as if I were already gone. But I wasn't gone. I was very much alive, in reasonably good health according to my doctor, and certainly not planning to die anytime soon, which meant one of two things. Either Michael and Janet knew something about my health that I didn't, or they were hoping I'd die soon enough to make their planning worthwhile. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Not the possibility of death, which was a reality I'd made peace with years ago, but the realization that my own son might be eagerly anticipating my departure from this world. I'd given Michael everything I had. After his father died, I'd worked myself to exhaustion to keep us afloat financially, while trying to be both mother and father to a grieving 8-year-old boy. I'd saved every penny I could for his college education, gone without new clothes and vacations and the 100 small luxuries that might have made my life easier. When he'd married Janet, I'd welcomed her into our family with genuine warmth, even when she'd made it clear that my presence in their lives was something to be managed rather than enjoyed. Now, apparently, my reward for a lifetime of sacrifice was to have my death anticipated and planned, like a relief they were all looking forward to. The bedroom felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in like the boundaries of a coffin they'd already selected for me. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd maintained for 4 decades. The tomatoes were coming in beautifully this year, heavy red globes that would be perfect for canning. The flowers I'd planted in spring were blooming in brilliant colors against the fence I'd painted myself just 3 years ago. This was my home, my life, my garden. These were my tomatoes, and my flowers, and my fence. I'd earned every inch of this property through 43 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, and constant maintenance. The idea that Michael and Janet were already calculating its market value while I stood in the bedroom where I slept every night felt like a violation of everything I'd worked for. But more than anger, I felt a deep sadness that surprised me with its intensity. This wasn't just about property or money or even the casual cruelty of planning someone's funeral while they were still alive. This was about love, or the absence of it. This was about the realization that the child I'd raised, the family I'd built, saw me not as a person to be cherished, but as an obstacle to be removed. I thought about my late husband, David, and wondered what he would have said about all this. David had been the dreamer in our marriage, always convinced that things would work out because people were fundamentally good. I'd been the practical one, managing our finances and making sure Michael did his homework and keeping us all grounded in reality. Now I wondered if David's optimism had been naive, if people weren't as good as he'd believed. Or maybe the problem wasn't people in general. Maybe the problem was that I'd failed somehow as a mother. Raised a son who could look at his aging parent and see only burden and inconvenience, instead of the woman who'd given him life and love and every opportunity she could provide. The afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor, where Michael had once played with toy cars and built elaborate structures out of building blocks. I remembered sitting on this same floor, helping him with homework and reading bedtime stories and talking through the fears and dreams that filled his young mind. He'd been such a sweet child, affectionate and thoughtful, always quick to hug me when I came home from work and eager to share the details of his day. When had that changed? When had I stopped being his mother and become just another problem to solve? The house was quiet now, no more discussion of funeral arrangements drifting through the walls. Michael and Janet had probably moved their planning session to their own bedroom, where they could speak more freely about their timeline and preparations. I wondered how long they'd been having these conversations, how many evenings they'd spent after I went to bed, discussing my approaching death like it was a vacation they were planning. My phone sat on the nightstand, and for a moment I considered calling my doctor to ask about my prognosis. Dr. Williams had seemed pleased with my progress at my last appointment, commenting on my blood pressure and lung function and overall vitality. But maybe there was something he hadn't told me, some test result or concerning symptom that he'd shared with Michael instead of me. No, that was ridiculous. Medical privacy laws meant my health information belonged to me, not my adult children. If Dr. Williams had concerns about my mortality, he would have discussed them with me directly. Which meant Michael and Janet's funeral planning wasn't based on medical necessity. It was based on wishful thinking. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my chest tight with pain that had nothing to do with any medical condition. My son was hoping I would die soon, not because I was suffering, not because death would be a mercy, but because my absence would make his life easier. I stood there in the bedroom that had once belonged to the little boy I'd loved more than my own life, surrounded by furniture that represented decades of memories and effort, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The grief and shock I'd been experiencing transformed into something harder, more focused. They wanted to plan my funeral? Fine. But they were going to discover that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated. I wasn't ready to die, and I certainly wasn't ready to make their lives more convenient by disappearing quietly. If Michael and Janet wanted to treat me like a problem to be solved, then I would show them what a real problem looked like. But first, I needed to understand exactly what they were planning and when. I needed to know how far this conspiracy extended and whether anyone else in my life was part of it. Most importantly, I needed to figure out how to respond in a way that would make my position absolutely clear. I was Dorothy Chen, 72 years old, owner of this house, mother to an ungrateful son, and very much alive. And if my family wanted to have a gathering to discuss my future, then I would make sure I was there to participate in the conversation. After all, it would be rude to miss my own funeral planning meeting. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually filled me with energy and purpose. Instead, I woke feeling like I'd been carrying stones in my chest all night, the weight of yesterday's discovery pressing down on everything I tried to do. Michael had already left for his job at the insurance office, and Janet was getting their 12-year-old daughter Sarah ready for school when I emerged from my room. "Morning, Grandma Dot," Sarah chirped, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she grabbed a piece of toast from the counter. At 12, she still possessed the unfiltered honesty that adults learn to suppress, and I found myself studying her face for any sign that she knew about her parents' macabre planning session. "Morning, sweetheart," I replied, pouring myself coffee from the pot Janet had made. "Big test today?" "Math quiz," she said, making a face. "Mom says you're really good at numbers. Maybe you could help me study tonight." Janet's laugh had a brittle edge to it. "Oh, honey, Grandma Dot needs to rest in the evenings." Remember what we talked about? What they'd talked about. I wondered if those conversations included explanations about why Grandma Dot might not be available for homework help much longer. The thought made my hands tremble slightly as I lifted my coffee mug, and I had to concentrate to keep my voice steady. "I'd be happy to help with math any time," I said directly to Sarah, ignoring Janet's sharp look. Numbers have always made sense to me. After Sarah left for school, Janet began her morning routine of wiping down counters that were already clean and reorganizing items that didn't need organizing. I recognized the behavior from my own nervous habits, the way people kept busy when they were avoiding difficult conversations. "I think I'll do some gardening today," I announced, watching Janet's reaction carefully. "The tomatoes need harvesting, and I want to plant some bulbs for spring." Janet paused in her unnecessary cleaning, her cloth suspended. Mid-wipe. "Spring bulbs? Don't you think that's a bit optimistic?" Optimistic, as if planning for spring was an unrealistic goal for someone my age. As if I was presumptuous to assume I'd live to see tulips bloom in 6 months. "I've been planting spring bulbs for 40 years, I said evenly. "I see no reason to stop now." "Of course not," Janet said quickly, but I caught the look she gave me, the careful assessment of someone cataloging symptoms of delusion in an elderly relative. "I just meant with your hip and all, maybe heavy gardening isn't the best idea." My hip. The completely healed injury that had become their excuse for everything. From why I shouldn't climb ladders, to why I couldn't be trusted to live alone. Dr. Williams had cleared me for all normal activities 3 months ago, but Michael and Janet clung to my temporary limitation like it was permanent proof of my declining capabilities. "My hip is fine," I said firmly. "Dr. Williams says I have the bone density of someone 20 years younger." "Still," Janet persisted, "maybe we should ask Michael what he thinks about you doing yard work. Ask Michael what he thinks about my own activities in my own garden behind my own house." The casual way she assumed his approval was required for my daily choices revealed everything about how they'd repositioned our family hierarchy without my consent. "I'll be careful," I said, ending the conversation by walking toward the back door. But as I stepped outside, I heard Janet's footsteps following me, and I realized I'd gained a supervisor for my gardening activities. The morning air felt good on my face as I walked through the garden I'd cultivated for decades. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit, their red globes perfect for the canning I'd planned to do this weekend. The marigolds I'd planted around the border were still blooming brilliantly, their orange and yellow faces turned toward the sun like tiny celebrations of life. Janet hovered near the porch, pretending to check her phone while actually monitoring my movements. I could feel her watching as I bent to examine the soil, waiting for me to stumble or show signs of weakness that would justify their concerns about my capabilities. Instead, I moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been tending this patch of earth since before Janet was born. I knew every plant, every corner, every subtle change in soil composition, that indicated what grew best where. This garden was an extension of myself, proof of my ability to nurture and sustain life. "The tomatoes look wonderful this year," I called to Janet, filling my basket with perfect specimens. "I'll make that sauce you liked so much." "Oh, you don't need to go to all that trouble," Janet replied, but her tone carried something beyond politeness. There was almost a note of panic in her voice, as if the idea of me making plans for preservation and future meals disrupted some timeline she had in mind. I spent 2 hours in the garden, long enough to harvest what I needed and to prove that I was perfectly capable of physical activity. Janet gave up her surveillance after the first hour, but I could see her checking on me through the kitchen window every few minutes. When I finally came inside with my basket of vegetables, I found Janet on the phone in the living room, her voice low and urgent. I caught fragments of the conversation as I washed tomatoes in the kitchen sink. "She seems completely normal today." "No signs at all." "I know what the doctor said, but maybe we should get a second opinion." "The doctor said." "What doctor?" I thought about my recent appointment with Dr. Williams, trying to remember if he'd mentioned any concerns to me directly. But our conversation had been routine, focused on my continued recovery and overall good health. Unless they'd spoken to a different doctor. Unless they'd sought out a medical opinion that would support their timeline for my departure. The thought chilled me more than the morning air had. Were Michael and Janet shopping for a diagnosis that would justify their funeral planning? Were they hoping to find a medical professional who would declare me terminally ill based on my age alone? I set down the tomato I'd been washing and walked quietly toward the living room, where Janet's phone conversation was continuing. "Tuesday would work better for our schedules," she was saying, and Dr. Peterson said the consultation could be done at home if that's easier. Dr. Peterson, a name I didn't recognize, which meant Janet was arranging medical appointments for me without my knowledge. In my own home, no less. "No, we haven't told her yet," Janet continued. "Michael thinks it's better to have all the information first, then present her with the options. Present me with options about my own medical care, without consulting me first." I felt anger building in my chest, hot and clean and energizing in a way I hadn't experienced in months. They weren't just planning my funeral anymore. They were actively seeking medical justification for their timeline, arranging consultations with doctors I'd never met to discuss my health behind my back. "Yes, tomorrow afternoon works fine," Janet said. She usually naps then anyway. "Tomorrow afternoon." When I usually spent time reading in my chair by the window, which Janet had apparently recharacterized as napping, as if rest were evidence of decline rather than a choice I made about how to spend my time. I retreated to the kitchen before Janet finished her call, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd overheard. Dr. Peterson, whoever he was, would be coming to my house tomorrow afternoon to evaluate me without my consent. Michael and Janet had arranged this consultation without informing me, planning to ambush me with whatever diagnosis they hoped he would provide. The tomatoes sat in the sink, bright red and perfect, waiting for me to process them into sauce that could last through the winter. I stared at them for a long moment, thinking about preservation and planning, and the assumption that I would be here to enjoy the fruits of my labor in the months to come. Then I dried my hands and walked to my bedroom, where I kept the small address book that contained 40 years of accumulated contacts. If Michael and Janet wanted to play games with my medical care, they were about to discover that I had resources they didn't know about. Dr. Margaret Foster had been my physician for 15 years before she retired last spring. More importantly, she'd been my friend, someone who'd seen me through David's death and Michael's difficult teenage years, and all the challenges that came with aging in a world that preferred to ignore elderly women. If anyone could help me understand what was happening, it would be Margaret. Her personal number rang 3 times before her familiar voice answered. "Dorothy! What a lovely surprise. How are you settling in with Michael's family?" "That's actually why I'm calling," I said, keeping my voice low in case Janet was still nearby. "Margaret, I need some advice about something medical, and I'm not sure who else to trust." There was a pause, and when Margaret spoke again, her tone had shifted into the careful professionalism I remembered from our doctor-patient relationship. What's going on, Dorothy? I explained about the conversation I'd overheard, the mysterious Dr. Peterson, and the home consultation that had been arranged without my knowledge. Margaret listened without interrupting, making small sounds of concern that told me my suspicions weren't unreasonable. Dorothy, she said when I finished, do you know what kind of doctor this Peterson is? What his specialty might be? No. I only heard Janet say he could do a consultation at home. House calls are fairly unusual these days, Margaret said thoughtfully. Most doctors who make home visits are either geriatricians, specializing in elderly care, or they're involved in hospice and end-of-life services. End-of-life services. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, confirming my worst suspicions about what Michael and Janet were trying to arrange. Margaret, my last appointment with Dr. Williams showed everything normal, didn't it? My blood work, my heart, my general health? Absolutely normal, she confirmed. In fact, you're in remarkably good shape for someone your age. Better than many of my patients who were 20 years younger. Then why would Michael and Janet be seeking another medical opinion? Margaret was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. Dorothy, sometimes families become overly anxious about elderly relatives, especially after an injury like your hip fracture. They may be seeking reassurance or they may be hoping for a different diagnosis, I finished. One that supports decisions they've already made. I don't want to assume the worst about your family, Margaret said gently. But I will say this. You have the right to be informed about any medical consultation involving your care. You have the right to choose your own physicians, and you have the right to refuse any evaluation you don't want. What if they try to declare me incompetent? What if this Dr. Peterson says I can't make my own decisions? Based on our conversation right now, you sound completely mentally competent to me, Margaret said firmly. You're articulate, you're reasoning clearly, and you're advocating for yourself appropriately. Any physician who declares you incompetent without proper evaluation and documentation would be acting unethically. But what should I do about tomorrow? First, you demand to know who Dr. Peterson is and why he's coming to your home. Second, you insist on being present for any conversation about your health. Third, if you're not comfortable with the consultation, you refuse to participate. And if Michael and Janet don't accept that? Margaret's voice hardened slightly. Then you call me, and we'll discuss your options for protecting your rights as a patient and as a person. After we hung up, I sat in my bedroom feeling both relieved and terrified. Relieved to have confirmation that my suspicions weren't paranoid, terrified to realize how far my own family was willing to go to achieve whatever outcome they had in mind. I spent the rest of the afternoon making tomato sauce, a process that usually brought me peace and satisfaction. There was something meditative about the rhythmic chopping, the careful seasoning, the slow simmering that transformed fresh vegetables into something that could nourish people for months to come. But today, even this familiar activity felt charged with meaning. Every jar I filled represented my intention to be here for the future, my refusal to accept their timeline for my departure. Janet watched me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. Several times she started to say something, then stopped herself, as if she was debating whether to mention tomorrow's appointment. When Michael came home from work, he found me at the stove, stirring a large pot of sauce while soft jazz played on the radio. The kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, and the kind of home cooking that takes time and patience to create properly. "Smells amazing in here," he said, kissing my cheek in a gesture that felt more like habit than affection. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble, Mom." "It's no trouble," I replied, not looking away from the stove. "I enjoy cooking. It gives me purpose." "Purpose," he repeated, and I caught something strange in his tone. "Mom, we need to talk about that. About finding you more. Appropriate activities." Appropriate activities. For someone my age, in my condition, with my limitations. The same limitations that existed only in their imagination, since my doctor had cleared me for normal activities months ago. "What kind of activities did you have in mind?" I asked, still stirring the sauce. Michael exchanged a look with Janet, one of those wordless conversations married couples have that exclude everyone else in the room. "Well, there are some wonderful programs for people in your situation. Adult day centers, senior activities, that sort of thing. adult day centers, where elderly people were supervised and entertained like children, kept busy with crafts and games while their families got on with their real lives. I'm not sure I understand what you mean by my situation, I said carefully. Mom? Michael's voice took on that patient tone people use with confused elderly relatives. You're 72 years old. You've had some health issues. It's natural that your energy levels and capabilities might be changing. Health issues. A single hip fracture that had healed completely, reframed as evidence of systemic decline. My energy levels and capabilities are fine, I said, turning to face him directly. I spent this morning gardening, this afternoon cooking, and I feel better than I have in months. That's good, Mom, Michael said, but his expression suggested that my good health was somehow problematic rather than positive. Sarah bounded into the kitchen then, her backpack hitting the floor with a thud that would normally earn her a reminder about taking care of her belongings. Instead, both Michael and Janet seemed grateful for the interruption. Grandma Dot, Sarah announced. I got an A on my math quiz. Mrs. Henderson said I showed my work really clearly. That's wonderful, sweetheart, I said, genuinely pleased. I told you that practicing those problems would help. Did you help her study? Janet asked, and there was something sharp in her voice. We worked on some practice problems yesterday evening, I confirmed. Sarah's very good at math when she applies herself. Michael and Janet exchanged another look, and I realized that even helping my granddaughter with homework was apparently cause for concern. As if my assistance with elementary mathematics was evidence of overreaching, of failing to recognize my proper place in the family hierarchy. Mom, Michael said slowly, we've been thinking that maybe you should focus more on resting, taking care of yourself. Let us handle the day-to-day responsibilities. Day-to-day responsibilities like cooking and gardening and helping with homework. The activities that made me feel useful and connected to the family I'd helped build. I like staying busy, I said. It keeps me healthy. But at your age, Janet interjected, it's important to know your limits. At my age. As if 72 was ancient. As if I should be grateful for each day and careful not to overextend myself with dangerous activities like stirring tomato sauce. What are my limits exactly? I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Well, you know, physical limitations, cognitive changes that are normal for someone your age. What cognitive changes? I pressed. Give me specific examples of cognitive decline you've observed in me. The silence that followed was telling. They couldn't point to specific examples because there weren't any. My memory was sharp, my reasoning clear, my ability to handle complex tasks unchanged from what it had been 5 years ago. It's not about specific incidents, Janet said finally. It's about being proactive, making sure you're safe and comfortable. Safe and comfortable. The same words people used when they moved elderly relatives into nursing homes, when they took away car keys and decision-making authority and anything else that suggested independent capability. I feel very safe and comfortable in my own home, I said firmly. In the house I've lived in for 43 years, tending the garden I planted, cooking in the kitchen I know better than any other room in the world. But Mom, Michael said, his frustration beginning to show, what if something happens? What if you fall again, or have a medical emergency when we're not here? Then I'll handle it the same way I handled emergencies for 30 years as a single parent, I replied. The same way I handled your father's death and my own health scares and every other crisis life has thrown at me. That was different, Janet said. You were younger then. Younger. The magic word that apparently explained everything, that justified any limitation they wanted to impose and any decision they wanted to make on my behalf. I was also less experienced, I pointed out, less wise, less patient, less aware of what really matters in life. Age has given me things as well as taken them away. Sarah had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention children give to adult conversations they sense are important but don't fully understand. Are you okay, Grandma Dot? She asked. You sound sad. I looked at my granddaughter, this bright, curious child who still saw me as a person rather than a problem to be managed, and felt my heart clench with love and determination. I'm fine, sweetheart, I said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Sometimes adults have to have difficult conversations, but that doesn't mean anything's wrong. Are you going to keep living with us? Sarah asked, and the innocence of her question highlighted the complexity of what was really happening. For now, I said, glancing at Michael and Janet, though I'm always open to discussing changes that might make everyone more comfortable. We're all comfortable, Michael said quickly. Aren't we, Janet? Of course, Janet agreed, but her smile looked strained. We just want what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone. The phrase that had become their justification for decisions I wasn't being allowed to participate in. For consultations arranged without my knowledge. For funeral planning conducted like I was already dead. Speaking of what's best, I said, deciding to test what I'd learned earlier, I'd like to make an appointment with Dr. Williams for a checkup. It's been a few months, and I want to make sure everything's still on track. Oh, that's not necessary, Janet said quickly. Actually, we've arranged for someone to come here tomorrow afternoon, a specialist who can evaluate your overall health situation more comprehensively. What kind of specialist? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dr. Peterson, Michael said. He's very experienced with geriatric care. He can help us understand what kind of support you might need going forward. Geriatric care. Support you might need. The careful language they used to avoid saying what they really meant. That they'd found a doctor willing to declare me incapable of independent living. Someone who would provide medical justification for whatever they'd already decided to do with me. I'd prefer to continue with Dr. Williams, I said calmly. He knows my medical history, and we have an established relationship. Dr. Peterson specializes in age-related issues, Janet explained. He'll be able to give us a more complete picture of your needs. Your needs, as determined by people other than me, based on assumptions about my capabilities, rather than actual assessment of my condition. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm quite capable of managing my own medical care. Of course you are, Michael said, but his tone suggested he was humoring me rather than agreeing with me. This is just a consultation, a second opinion to make sure we're not missing anything important. As if my health were a family project rather than a personal matter, as if their anxiety about my aging gave them authority over my medical decisions. I turned back to the stove, where my tomato sauce was simmering perfectly, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma of herbs and vegetables transformed into something nourishing and preserving. Tomorrow, Dr. Peterson would arrive expecting to find a confused elderly woman who needed other people to make decisions for her. Instead, he would meet Dorothy Chen, 72 years old, mentally sharp, physically capable, and absolutely unwilling to be managed by anyone. The sauce was ready to be jarred, each container representing months of future meals, proof of my intention to be here for the long term. As I filled the mason jars with careful precision, I thought about preservation and planning, and the difference between accepting mortality and surrendering to other people's timelines. I wasn't ready to be preserved in memory. I was still very much alive, still capable of creating and nurturing and making decisions about my own life. And tomorrow, when Dr. Peterson arrived for his unauthorized consultation, I would make sure that message was absolutely clear. After all, it's hard to evaluate someone who refuses to be evaluated, and even harder to declare someone incompetent when they demonstrate complete competence in every interaction. Michael and Janet thought they were managing my decline. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long, the fierce determination that had carried me through decades of challenges and loss. They wanted a consultation about my capabilities? They were about to get a demonstration of exactly how capable I really was. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, just as Janet had scheduled. I was waiting in my reading chair by the front window, watching Dr. Peterson climb out of a sleek black sedan that screamed expensive consultation fees. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 55, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Michael had taken the afternoon off work, claiming he wanted to be present for the consultation. Janet had spent the morning cleaning the house as if we were expecting royalty, even though the house was already spotless. They had both suggested I might want to rest in my room during the appointment, which confirmed everything I suspected about their intentions. Instead, I remained in my chair, wearing my best navy dress and the pearl earrings my mother had left me. If Dr. Peterson expected to find a confused elderly woman in her nightgown, he was about to be disappointed. "Dr. Peterson," Michael said, opening the front door with the kind of eager politeness reserved for people you desperately need to impress. "Thank you so much for coming to the house. We really appreciate your flexibility." "Not a problem at all," Dr. Peterson replied, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to making house calls to wealthy families. "I find that evaluating patients in their home environment often provides valuable insights." Evaluating patients. I wasn't his patient, had never met him before, and had never consented to any evaluation. But apparently those details were considered minor technicalities. "This is my mother, Dorothy," Michael said, gesturing toward my chair as if I were a piece of furniture to be examined. "Mom, this is Dr. Peterson." I stood up with deliberate grace, extending my hand for a firm handshake that would immediately contradict any preconceptions about frail elderly women. "Dr. Peterson," I said clearly, making sure my voice carried the authority of someone fully in command of her faculties. "I understand you wanted to meet me, though I'm not entirely sure why." Something flickered in Dr. Peterson's eyes, a slight recalibration as he realized this wasn't going to be the straightforward evaluation he'd been expecting. "Mrs. Chen, your family is concerned about your well-being and wanted a professional assessment of your current situation." "My current situation," I repeated. "Which is what, exactly?" Dr. Peterson glanced at Michael, clearly expecting him to provide context for whatever script they'd prepared. "Well, you're living with family after a recent injury, and there are concerns about your ability to maintain independent living." "What concerns specifically?" I asked, settling back into my chair and gesturing for him to take the sofa across from me. "And, based on what medical evidence?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. Most elderly patients probably didn't challenge his authority or demand specifics about his assessment criteria. "Your son mentioned some cognitive changes, some difficulty with daily activities." "Which daily activities?" I interrupted. "Because yesterday I harvested vegetables from my garden, prepared a complex tomato sauce recipe from memory, helped my granddaughter with her mathematics homework, and managed my own medication schedule without any assistance or reminders." Dr. Peterson looked at Michael again, who shifted uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa. "Mom, you know there have been some concerning incidents." "Such as?" The silence that followed was telling. They couldn't point to specific incidents, because there hadn't been any, but they'd apparently led Dr. Peterson to believe there were documented problems with my mental capacity. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Peterson said carefully, "could you be more specific about the cognitive concerns you mentioned when we spoke on the phone?" Michael's face flushed slightly. "Well, it's not so much specific incidents as general decline. You know how it is with people her age." "People her age?" The casual ageism that assumed decline was inevitable and comprehensive, that reaching 72 automatically meant losing the ability to make rational decisions about my own life. "Dr. Peterson," I said, reclaiming control of the conversation, "what type of physician are you? What's your specialty?" "I'm a geriatrician with additional training in end-of-life care and family counseling," he replied, and I felt a chill run down my spine. End-of-life care. They'd brought in someone who specialized in managing dying patients. And who requested this consultation? Because I certainly didn't. "Your son called my office expressing concerns about your cognitive status and your ability to make informed decisions about your care." "Based on what evidence?" I pressed. "Have you reviewed my medical records? Spoken to my primary physician? Conducted any actual assessment of my mental state?" Dr. Peterson was beginning to look uncomfortable, realizing that his usual approach of speaking primarily to family members, while treating the patient as a passive subject, wasn't going to work in this situation. "Mrs. Chen," he said, pulling out a tablet and stylus, "why don't we start with some basic questions? Can you tell me today's date?" I almost laughed. "Tuesday, October 15th, 2024. The president is Joe Biden, though there's an election next month. The capital of Iowa is Des Moines, not Iowa City as many people incorrectly believe. I can recite the alphabet backwards, count down from 100 by sevens, and tell you the names and birth dates of every person who's lived in this house for the past 4 decades." That's very good, Dr. Peterson said, making notes on his tablet. It's completely normal, I corrected. There's nothing remarkable about a 72-year-old woman knowing basic facts about her life and surroundings. Janet had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she leaned forward with the expression of someone playing her trump card. Dr. Peterson, we're concerned about Dorothy's judgment. She's been making unrealistic plans, talking about projects that span years into the future. Such as? She planted bulbs for spring, Janet said, as if this were evidence of serious delusion. She's been talking about canning vegetables for winter storage, making long-term plans that might not be appropriate for someone in her situation. And what situation is that? I asked sharply. Because as far as I know, I'm in excellent health with a normal life expectancy for someone my age. Dr. Peterson looked between Michael, Janet, and me, clearly realizing that he'd walked into a family conflict rather than a straightforward medical evaluation. Mrs. Chen, have you had any recent medical examinations? Any concerning symptoms or changes in your health? I saw Dr. Williams 6 weeks ago for my quarterly checkup, I replied. Normal blood pressure, excellent blood work, good lung function, complete healing of my hip fracture with full range of motion restored. He was very pleased with my overall condition. Dr. Williams is her primary care physician, Michael added quickly, but we thought a specialist's perspective might be helpful. Helpful for what? I demanded. Dr. Peterson, what exactly did my son tell you when he requested this consultation? Dr. Peterson checked his notes, and I could see him weighing his professional obligations against the growing realization that this wasn't the situation he'd been led to expect. Mr. Chen indicated that you'd been showing signs of cognitive decline and poor judgment, that there were concerns about your safety living independently, and that the family needed guidance about appropriate levels of care. And did he mention that I don't actually live independently? I asked. That I've been living here in this house under their supervision for 8 months? That every activity I engage in, from gardening to cooking to helping my granddaughter with homework, is observed and evaluated for signs of incompetence? The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock that had belonged to my husband's grandmother. Dr. Peterson looked at his tablet, then at Michael and Janet, then back at me. Mrs. Chen, he said carefully, are you saying that this consultation was arranged without your knowledge or consent? That's exactly what I'm saying. Yesterday I overheard my daughter-in-law arranging this appointment while I was washing vegetables in my own kitchen. No one asked if I wanted a second medical opinion. No one explained why it was necessary. No one even bothered to inform me until this morning that a stranger would be coming to my home to evaluate my mental capacity. Dr. Peterson's expression shifted, and I could see him recognizing the ethical minefield he'd stumbled into. Mr. Chen, is this accurate? Michael squirmed under the direct question. We thought it would be less stressful for Mom if we handled the arrangements ourselves. You know how elderly patients can become anxious about medical appointments. I'm not anxious about medical appointments, I said firmly. I'm concerned about family members making medical decisions behind my back and bringing strangers into my home to evaluate me without my consent. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Peterson said, closing his tablet and leaning forward slightly, you appear to be completely mentally competent. Your responses are clear, your reasoning is sound, and you're advocating for yourself appropriately. I'm not sure why a geriatric consultation was considered necessary. Janet jumped in quickly. But what about her age? Shouldn't someone her age be thinking about transitioning to more supportive living arrangements? Planning for when she can't take care of herself. Planning for future care needs is certainly wise, Dr. Peterson replied. But it should be done by the patient in consultation with their primary physician, not imposed by family members who are concerned about theoretical future problems. Theoretical? Michael's voice rose slightly. She's 72 years old. She fell and broke her hip 8 months ago. How is that theoretical? Dr. Peterson looked at me with what might have been respect. Mrs. Chen, how do you feel about your current living situation? It was the first time anyone had asked me directly about my preferences rather than making assumptions about what was best for me. I appreciate my family's concern, I said carefully, but I'd prefer to make my own decisions about my medical care and living arrangements based on actual assessments of my capabilities rather than fears about what might happen someday. That seems entirely reasonable, Dr. Peterson said, and I could see Michael and Janet exchange worried glances. But surely, Janet pressed, there should be some planning for end-of-life care? Some discussion of what happens when she can't live independently anymore? End-of-life care. There it was. The real reason they'd called in a specialist. They wanted him to validate their timeline, to confirm that I was closer to death than I believed, and that planning for my funeral was reasonable and necessary. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Peterson said, based on what I've observed today and what you've told me about your recent medical evaluation, you appear to be in good health for someone your age. While it's always wise to have advanced directives and to discuss preferences for future care, there's no medical indication that you're approaching end of life. No medical indication, I repeated, looking directly at Michael. So the consultation about end-of-life care was requested because… Michael's face was red now, caught between his genuine concern and the growing realization that his assumptions about my condition weren't supported by medical evidence. Mom, we just want to be prepared. We want to make sure you get the best possible care when the time comes. When the time comes for what? For when you need more help, Janet said quickly. When living here becomes too difficult. Has it become too difficult? Dr. Peterson asked me directly. The only thing that's become difficult, I said, is living with people who seem to be eagerly anticipating my decline and death instead of supporting my continued health and independence. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Dr. Peterson looked genuinely uncomfortable now, realizing he'd been brought in to validate a family agenda rather than conduct a legitimate medical evaluation. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, he said formally, I think there may be some communication issues here that would benefit from family counseling rather than medical intervention. Mrs. Chen appears to be competent to make her own decisions about her care. But what about planning ahead? Michael insisted. What about making sure she's prepared for when her health changes? Those conversations should happen between Mrs. Chen and her primary physician, Dr. Peterson replied firmly. And they should be initiated by the patient, not imposed by concerned family members. I stood up, feeling stronger and more determined than I had in months. Dr. Peterson, thank you for your time. I think this consultation is complete. He nodded, gathering his things with the efficiency of someone eager to escape an Enmore's uncomfortable situation. Mrs. Chen, if you ever want to discuss your care options or have questions about aging and health management, I'd be happy to schedule a proper appointment at your request. I'll keep that in mind, I said, walking him to the door with the dignity of someone reclaiming control of her own life. After Dr. Peterson left, the house felt different, charged with tension and unspoken accusations. Michael and Janet stood in the living room, looking like children who'd been caught in a lie, which in many ways they had been. Mom, Michael started, but I held up my hand to stop him. I need some time to think about what just happened, I said quietly. I need to understand why my own family thought it was necessary to bring in a stranger to evaluate my mental capacity without my knowledge or consent. We were trying to help, Janet said weakly. No, I replied, my voice steady and clear. You were trying to get professional validation for decisions you'd already made about my life. There's a difference. I walked to my bedroom and closed the door, not with anger, but with the calm determination of someone who'd just received confirmation of everything she'd suspected. Dr. Peterson had inadvertently given me something valuable, professional verification that I was completely competent to make my own decisions. But more than that, his uncomfortable questions had revealed the extent of Michael and Janet's planning. They hadn't just been discussing my funeral. They'd been building a case for my incompetence, trying to establish medical justification for taking control of my life. I sat on my bed and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. When Margaret Foster answered, her voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship. Dorothy, how did the mysterious consultation go? Better than expected, I said, and found myself smiling for the first time in days. Dr. Peterson was very clear that I'm completely competent to make my own decisions. He also seemed quite uncomfortable when he realized he'd been brought in under false pretenses. Good for you, Margaret said. And good for him for recognizing an ethical problem when he saw one. Margaret, I need advice about something else. Something I overheard that makes me think this situation is worse than I originally thought. I told her about the funeral planning conversation, about the life insurance policy Michael had found, about the casual discussion of selling my house and dividing my possessions. Margaret listened with the same careful attention she'd always given to my concerns. "Dorothy," she said when I finished, "that's not just inappropriate family planning. That's financial elder abuse. They're making plans based on your assets while deliberately trying to undermine your autonomy. What should I do? First, you document everything. Dates, times, conversations you've overheard. Second, you make sure your legal affairs are in order, and that you have copies of all important documents. Third, you consider whether you want to continue living in a situation where your own family is actively working against your interests. Where else would I go? Dorothy, you own that house. You've lived there for 43 years. The question isn't where you would go. The question is whether you want to continue allowing people who don't respect your autonomy to live in your space." The thought hadn't occurred to me before, but Margaret was right. This was my house, my home, my sanctuary that I'd built and maintained for decades. Michael and Janet had moved in to help me after my injury, but that didn't give them ownership or authority over my life. "I never thought of it that way," I admitted. "Start thinking of it that way," Margaret said firmly. "You're not a guest in your own home, Dorothy. You're not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. You're a competent adult woman who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Through the window, I could see the garden I'd tended for 40 years. The tomato plants heavy with fruit, the flowers still blooming despite the approaching winter. This was my life, my space, my choice about how to spend whatever years remained to me. I wasn't ready to surrender any of that to people who saw me as an obstacle to their plans, rather than a person deserving of love and respect. That evening, when Sarah came home from school, she knocked on my bedroom door with the gentle courtesy that had always characterized our relationship. "Grandma Dot, are you okay? Mom and Dad seem really upset about something." I opened the door to find my granddaughter standing there with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her young face creased with concern that broke my heart and strengthened my resolve simultaneously. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, stepping aside to let her into my room. "The adults just had some disagreements about medical stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." "Are you sick?" she asked directly, and I realized that Sarah's straightforward approach to difficult questions was something I could learn from. "No, honey. I'm healthy and planning to stay that way for a long time." "Good," she said simply. "I like having you here. You actually listen when I talk about school, and you don't check your phone while I'm explaining things." The casual observation hit me like a revelation. This 12-year-old girl valued my presence, my attention, my genuine interest in her life. She didn't see me as a burden or a problem to be managed. She saw me as someone who cared about her thoughts and experiences. "Sarah," I said carefully, "how would you feel if I decided to move back to living by myself?" Her face fell immediately. "Did Mom and Dad say something mean to you? Because sometimes they're really stupid about grown-up stuff. Sometimes they're really stupid about grown-up stuff. The wisdom of children. Cutting through adult complications to reach the heart of the matter." "No one said anything mean," I assured her. "I'm just thinking about what would make everyone most comfortable." "I'd be most comfortable if you stayed here forever," Sarah said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "But if you did move back to your own space, could I still come visit? Could we still work on homework together?" "Of course," I said, hugging her close. "Distance doesn't change love, sweetheart." As Sarah headed to her room to start her homework, I realized that I'd been approaching this situation all wrong. I'd been thinking like a victim, someone whose life was being planned by others without her input. But I wasn't a victim. I was Dorothy Chen, homeowner, independent woman, grandmother, who was loved and valued by at least one member of this family. If Michael and Janet wanted to plan a funeral, they were welcome to do so. But it would have to be their own, because I had no intention of dying anytime soon. And if they wanted to continue living in my house, they were going to have to learn to treat me like the competent adult I was, rather than the incompetent burden they seemed to believe I'd become. The conversation with Dr. Peterson had given me something I hadn't expected: clarity about my rights and confirmation of my competence. Now I needed to decide how to use that information to reclaim control of my life. Outside my bedroom window, the autumn sun was setting behind the trees I'd watched grow, from saplings to towering oaks. This was my view, my sunset, my life to live as I chose. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to start making choices that reflected my own values, rather than accommodating other people's fears. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my autonomy. Tonight, I would plan exactly how to make that happen. Thursday morning brought the kind of crisp October weather that had always energized me, and I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The conversation with Dr. Peterson had crystallized something important. I wasn't losing my mind, my family was losing their perspective. Armed with professional confirmation of my competence and Margaret's advice about documenting everything, I had work to do. I dressed carefully in my best burgundy sweater and gray slacks, the kind of outfit that projected competence and authority. If I was going to reclaim control of my life, I needed to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with clear eyes and determined expression, someone who had weathered 7 decades of challenges and wasn't about to surrender now. Michael had already left for work, and Janet was in the kitchen preparing Sarah's lunch, with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through familiar motions while distracted by larger concerns. I could tell from her tight shoulders and the way she avoided eye contact that yesterday's failed consultation had left her unsettled. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself coffee from the pot she'd made. "Morning," Janet replied without looking up from the sandwich she was wrapping. "How did you sleep?" The question carried weight beyond politeness. She was probably wondering if I'd spent the night plotting revenge or making plans to complicate their lives further. In a way, she wasn't wrong. "Very well, thank you," I said, settling at the kitchen table with my coffee and the notepad I'd brought from my room. "I've been thinking about some changes that might make everyone more comfortable." Janet's hands stilled on the sandwich wrapper. "What kind of changes?" "I'd like to discuss household arrangements," I said calmly. "Responsibilities, expectations, that sort of thing." She turned to face me fully, her expression cautious. "What do you mean exactly?" I opened my notepad, where I'd spent the early morning hours writing down everything I could remember about the funeral planning conversation and the unauthorized medical consultation. Margaret had been right about documentation being important, and I wanted to establish a clear record of what had been happening. "I mean that I think we need to clarify some things," I said, looking directly at her. "Starting with the fact that this is my house, and I'd like to be included in decisions that affect my life." Janet's face flushed slightly. "Of course it's your house. We've never suggested otherwise." "Haven't you?" I asked gently. "Because when I heard you and Michael discussing the real estate market and how the property should transfer automatically, it sounded very much like you were planning for a future that didn't include me." The color drained from Janet's face completely. "You heard that?" "I heard quite a lot of things," I confirmed, "including conversations about funeral arrangements and catering options, and flower choices for a service apparently intended for someone who's sitting right here, very much alive." Janet sank into the chair across from me, her carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time since I'd moved in. "Dorothy, we can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said, my voice remaining steady despite the anger I felt building in my chest. "But first, I'd like you to explain why you thought it was appropriate to plan my funeral without mentioning that I was dying." "We didn't. We weren't." Janet struggled to find words that could somehow justify the unjustifiable. "We were just being prepared. Planning ahead." "For what? My death next week? Next month? Or were you hoping Dr. Peterson would provide a timeline that made your planning seem reasonable?" Janet's hands twisted in her lap, and I could see her calculating how much to admit and how much to deny. "We're concerned about you, Dorothy. About your health, your safety, your ability to continue living independently." "Based on what evidence?" I pressed. Because Dr. Peterson seemed quite confused about why a geriatric consultation was necessary for someone in my condition. "You're 72, Janet said, as if that explained everything. "Yes, I am. And yesterday I was 72 and competent. Today I'm 72 and competent. Tomorrow I'll be 72 and competent." My age hasn't changed, but apparently your perception of what that age means has become rather dramatic. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack in hand and eyes wide with the recognition that another adult conversation was happening that would affect her world. "Is everything okay?" she asked, looking between her mother and me. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I said, softening my voice for her benefit. "Your mom and I are just discussing some family business. Are you moving out?" Sarah asked directly, and I realized that children often cut through adult pretense to reach the heart of what mattered. "I'm considering some changes," I said honestly. "But whatever happens, it won't change how much I love you or how important you are to me." Janet shot me a look that suggested I was manipulating her daughter, but Sarah nodded with the acceptance children show when adults are honest with them about difficult situations. "Can we still do homework together tonight?" Sarah asked. "Absolutely," I promised, and she smiled before heading out to catch her school bus. After Sarah left, the kitchen felt smaller, more charged with tension. Janet and I sat across from each other like negotiators, preparing for difficult discussions, which in many ways we were. "Dorothy," Janet said finally, "I know how this must look, but we really were trying to do what's best for everyone." "What's best according to whom?" I asked, because no one asked me what I thought was best. No one consulted me about my preferences for medical care or living arrangements or anything else that affects my life. We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. Worry me about what? About my own life? About decisions being made regarding my future? Janet, I've been managing worry and difficult decisions for 72 years. I think I can handle knowing what's being planned in my own home. Janet was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes held something that might have been genuine remorse. "We've been scared," she admitted quietly. "Michael especially. He lost his father so young, and the idea of losing you too. So you decided to plan my funeral to help manage that fear?" "We decided to be prepared for every possibility, including the possibility that I might live for many more years and want to participate in decisions about my own life." Janet winced. "We didn't think about it that way." "No, you didn't. You thought about me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected." The truth of that statement hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. I could see Janet struggling with recognition of how their behavior must have seemed from my perspective. "What do you want from us?" she asked finally. "I want to be treated like a competent adult," I said simply. "I want to be consulted about medical appointments before they're scheduled. I want my opinion considered when household decisions are made. I want to feel like I'm living with family who values my presence rather than tolerates my existence." "We do value your presence," Janet said quickly. "Do you? Because from where I sit, it feels like you've been counting down the days until you can have your house back and your lives simplified by my absence." Janet's face crumpled slightly, and I realized that some of my words had hit closer to the truth than either of us was comfortable admitting. "Dorothy, can I ask you something honestly?" "Please do." "Are you happy living here? Really happy, not just making the best of a difficult situation?" The question surprised me with its directness. I considered it carefully, thinking about the past 8 months of walking on eggshells, and having my capabilities questioned, and feeling like a guest in my own life. "I'm happy when I feel useful and valued," I said, finally. "I'm happy when I'm cooking dinner, or helping Sarah with homework, or tending the garden. I'm unhappy when I feel like every activity is being evaluated for signs of decline, or every conversation is being monitored for evidence that I can't take care of myself." "We weren't trying to make you feel that way. Intent doesn't always match impact," I said gently. "You may not have intended to make me feel like a burden, but that's the effect your behavior has had." Janet nodded slowly, and I could see her processing this information with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "I didn't realize we were being so obvious about our concerns. Obvious enough that your 12-year-old daughter noticed that you think I should take it easier and not plan for the future." "Sarah said that?" "Sarah said that her parents seemed worried about me doing too much. Making long-term plans, staying active. Children see everything, Janet. They just don't always understand the implications of what they're observing." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the kitchen clock marking time with its steady rhythm. I could see Janet working through the implications of our conversation, perhaps recognizing for the first time how her fears about my aging had translated into treatment that made me feel diminished and unwanted. "What would make you feel more valued?" she asked finally. "Being asked for my opinion instead of having decisions made for me. Being trusted to know my own limitations rather than having them defined by other people. Being treated like someone whose presence adds value to this household rather than someone whose needs create problems." But what about safety? What about planning for when you do need more help? "When I need more help, I'll ask for it," I said firmly. "And when that time comes, I'd like to be part of the conversation about what kind of help would be most appropriate. I don't want decisions made behind my back based on assumptions about what's best for me." "That seems reasonable," Janet admitted. "It is reasonable. What's unreasonable is arranging medical consultations without my knowledge and discussing my funeral arrangements while I'm alive and healthy." Janet winced again. "You really heard all of that?" "I heard enough to understand that you and Michael have been planning for my death with considerably more enthusiasm than you've shown for supporting my life." "That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time either of you expressed genuine pleasure about something I accomplished? When did you last ask about my goals or interests rather than questioning whether I should be pursuing them?" Janet thought about this, and I could see her struggling to come up with examples that would contradict my observation. "We appreciate everything you do," she said finally. "Appreciation and enthusiasm are different things. You appreciate my contributions because they make your lives easier. But you don't encourage my activities because you're afraid I'm overestimating my capabilities." "Maybe we have been overly cautious," Janet conceded. "Maybe you've been planning for the wrong future," I said. "Maybe instead of preparing for my decline and death, you should be supporting my continued health and independence." "How do we do that?" The question felt like a small victory, an acknowledgement that their approach needed to change, and a request for guidance about how to do better. "You start by asking me what I want instead of assuming you know. You include me in conversations about household decisions instead of discussing them behind my back. You trust me to communicate my needs rather than trying to anticipate problems that may never arise. And if problems do arise, if your health changes or you need more support, then we deal with those issues when they happen, together, with my input and preferences guiding the decisions." Janet nodded slowly. "I think I understand. You want to be treated like a partner in your own care, rather than someone who needs care managed for them." "Exactly. I can see how we might have gotten that wrong. The question is whether you're willing to get it right going forward." Janet was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her working through the implications of changing their entire approach to my presence in their household. "Can I ask you something else?" she said finally. "Of course. If we do better, if we include you more and respect your autonomy more, would you consider staying? Or have we damaged things too badly for that to work?" The question surprised me. I'd been so focused on establishing my rights and dignity that I hadn't fully considered whether I wanted to continue living with people who demonstrated such poor judgment about my capabilities. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That would depend on whether the changes feel genuine or whether they're just a new strategy for managing me more effectively." "How would you tell the difference?" "Time and consistency," I said. "Anyone can change their behavior temporarily when they're caught doing something inappropriate. Real change shows up in small daily interactions over months of living together. Would you be willing to give us a chance to prove we can do better?" I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent so many mornings feeling like an intruder in my own life, and tried to imagine what it might feel like to belong here genuinely, rather than being tolerated out of obligation. "I'd be willing to try," I said carefully, "but with clear understanding that this is my house, my choice about how to live, and my decision about what level of involvement I want in family activities." "That seems fair. And with the understanding that if I feel like I'm being managed or manipulated or pushed toward decisions I don't want to make, I'll reconsider the entire arrangement." "Understood. And Janet, no more medical consultations without my consent. No more discussions about my future that don't include me. No more planning for events you hope won't be necessary for many years to come." Janet's face reddened, but she nodded. "No more funeral planning." "No more funeral planning," I confirmed. When Michael came home that evening, he found Janet and me working together in the kitchen, preparing dinner with an ease that hadn't existed between us in months. I was making fresh pasta while she prepared a salad, and we were actually talking about Sarah's school project rather than my limitations or their concerns. "This looks nice," Michael said cautiously, clearly unsure what to make of the domestic harmony he was witnessing. "Your wife and I had a productive conversation today," I said, not looking up from the pasta dough I was rolling. "We've clarified some expectations about household communication and decision-making." Michael shot a questioning look at Janet, who gave him a slight nod that suggested he should be prepared for changes in how they approached my presence in their lives. "What kind of expectations?" he asked carefully. "The kind that involve treating me like a competent adult who deserves to be included in conversations about her own life," I said pleasantly, as if I was discussing the weather rather than delivering what amounted to an ultimatum. Michael sat down heavily at the kitchen table, his expression suggesting he was beginning to understand that yesterday's consultation hadn't gone according to their plans in more ways than one. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened with Dr. Peterson." "Yes, we do," I agreed, still working with the pasta. "We need to talk about why you thought it was appropriate to arrange a medical evaluation without my knowledge or consent. We need to discuss why you led him to believe I was showing signs of cognitive decline when you had no evidence to support that claim. And we need to address why you've been making plans for my future without including me in those conversations." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the sounds of dinner preparation and the distant noise of Sarah practicing piano in the living room. Michael looked between Janet and me, clearly realizing that whatever conversation they'd had that day had fundamentally altered the dynamics of our household. "I think," he said slowly, "we may have handled some things poorly. That's one way to put it," I said, finally looking up from my work to meet his eyes directly. "Another way would be to say that you've been treating me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. We were trying to help. No, you were trying to control. There's a difference. And it's time you learn to recognize it." Michael was quiet for a long moment, perhaps finally understanding that the careful balance of power in our household had shifted permanently. I wasn't the same woman who'd moved in 8 months ago, grateful for their assistance and willing to accept their limitations on my autonomy. I was Dorothy Chen, homeowner, competent adult, and grandmother who deserved better treatment than she'd been receiving. "What do you want from us going forward?" he asked finally. "I want you to include me in decisions that affect my life. I want you to trust me to communicate my needs rather than assuming you know what they are. And I want you to stop planning for my death, while I'm still very much alive and intending to stay that way." The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, covering everything from household responsibilities to medical care to long-term planning that actually included my preferences rather than working around my assumed incapacity. By the time we finished talking, we'd established new ground rules that felt more like a partnership than a caretaking arrangement. It wasn't perfect, and I knew that changing ingrained patterns would take time and consistent effort from all of us. But it was a beginning, a foundation for building something better than what we'd had before. As I got ready for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope that I could continue living in my own home without sacrificing my dignity or autonomy. The conversation with Dr. Peterson had given me confirmation of my competence, but the conversation with my family had given me something even more valuable: the possibility that they could learn to see me as I actually was, rather than as they feared I might become. Change was possible, even for relationships that had been damaged by fear and misunderstanding. The question was whether that change would prove genuine and lasting, or whether this was simply a temporary adjustment until they found new ways to pursue their original agenda. Time would tell, but for tonight, I was content to have reclaimed my voice and my place in my own life. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of building something new from the foundation we'd established today. 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a family that looked nothing like the one I'd been living with a month ago. The house smelled of roasting turkey and sage stuffing, of pumpkin pie cooling on the counter and the cranberry sauce I'd made from my own recipe that morning. Everything felt familiar, yet fundamentally different, as if I was inhabiting the same space but with completely altered relationships. Sarah burst through the back door carrying a bouquet of late-season flowers she'd picked from the garden, her cheeks pink from the November cold. "Grandma Dot, these are for the table. I thought they'd look pretty with your good dishes." "They're perfect, sweetheart," I said, accepting the slightly wilted but enthusiastic offering. "Would you like to arrange them in the blue vase?" As Sarah busied herself with the flowers, Michael and Janet worked around me in the kitchen with an ease that had taken weeks to develop. They asked before moving my ingredients, checked before adjusting the oven temperature, included me in decisions about timing and presentation. Small changes, but they represented a complete reversal of how we'd functioned before. "Mom, what time did you want to eat?" Michael asked, pulling the turkey from the oven with careful precision. "Everything seems to be on schedule." 2 o'clock, like we discussed, I replied, pleased that he'd asked rather than assuming or making the decision independently. That gives us time to let the turkey rest properly. Janet was setting the table with my grandmother's china, handling each piece with the reverence I'd hoped for but never expected. "Dorothy, should we use the silver candlesticks too? The ones from your dining room cabinet?" "I'd love that," I said, meaning it completely. "They belonged to my mother. She always said holidays weren't complete without proper candles." These were the conversations I'd been longing for, the inclusion in decision-making and the respect for my preferences that had been missing for so long. The changes hadn't happened overnight, and there had been several difficult discussions when old patterns reasserted themselves, but gradually we'd found our way to something that felt like genuine partnership. The turning point had come 2 weeks ago, when I'd received a call from my attorney's office about updating my will. Instead of handling it privately, or asking Michael to drive me to the appointment, I'd announced my plans at dinner and asked if anyone wanted to discuss what I was considering. The conversation that followed had been awkward but necessary. Michael and Janet learned that I'd been thinking about dividing my estate differently than they'd assumed, including provisions for Sarah's education and charitable donations that would reduce the amount they'd inherit. More importantly, they learned that I was actively planning for a future that extended years beyond what they'd been preparing for. "I'm not dying anytime soon," I'd told them plainly. "And when I do eventually die, probably many years from now, I want my legacy to reflect my values and my choices, not what other people think I should do with my assets." That conversation had forced us all to confront the difference between planning for an inevitable future and wishing for a convenient one. Michael and Janet had been embarrassed to realize how their eagerness to plan had revealed their eagerness to inherit, but they'd also been relieved to understand that their inheritance wouldn't disappear, simply because I was living longer than they'd expected. Now, as we prepared to share our first holiday meal since establishing our new household dynamics, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine gratitude for my family's presence in my life. "Can I say something before we eat?" Sarah asked as we gathered around the dining room table that had hosted 43 years of holiday meals. "Of course, honey," Michael said, pulling out her chair with the courtesy that had become more consistent in recent weeks. "I want to say I'm thankful that Grandma Dot is still here with us," Sarah said simply. "And I'm thankful that everyone stopped being weird about grown-up stuff and started acting like a family again." Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah's observation captured exactly what had changed in our household. We'd stopped being weird about grown-up stuff and started acting like a family. "I'm thankful for that too," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "And I'm thankful for second chances, for families that can learn from their mistakes, and for granddaughters who remind us what's really important." Michael cleared his throat slightly, and I could see him working up to something he'd been thinking about for several days. "Mom, I owe you an apology. A real one, not just for specific things we did wrong, but for losing sight of who you are." "What do you mean?" I asked gently. "I mean that somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as my mother who raised me and taught me everything important I know, and started seeing you as someone I needed to take care of whether you wanted that care or not." "And?" I prompted, sensing there was more he needed to say. "And I think I was so afraid of losing you the way I lost Dad, that I started treating you like you were already gone. Planning for your death instead of supporting your life." The admission hung in the warm air of the dining room, heavy with the weight of recognition and regret. Janet reached over and took Michael's hand, her own expression reflecting similar understanding. "I did the same thing," she said quietly. "I was so focused on being prepared for every possibility that I forgot to appreciate what we actually had." "We all made mistakes," I said, though I was pleased they'd finally articulated the core of what had gone wrong. The important thing is that we learned from them. Did we, though? Michael asked. Really learn, I mean. Or are we just being more careful about how we express our concerns? It was a fair question, one that went to the heart of whether our recent changes represented genuine growth or strategic adjustment. I considered it carefully before answering. I think you've learned that treating me like a competent adult produces better results than trying to manage me like a problem, I said finally. Whether that's because you genuinely see me differently, or because you've discovered I won't tolerate being managed, is less important than the outcome. But it matters to you which one it is, doesn't it? Sarah asked, with the kind of insight that continually surprised me. Yes, it does matter, I admitted. But I also think feelings can follow behavior. If you act like you respect my autonomy long enough, you might discover that you actually do respect it. I already do, Michael said firmly. Respect it, I mean. I think I always did, but I let my fear override my respect. Fear of what? Fear of losing you. Fear of not being a good enough son. Fear of making the wrong decisions about your care when the time came. And now? Michael smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen from him in months. Now I think the best way to be a good son is to trust that you'll tell me what you need when you need it, instead of trying to anticipate problems that may never happen. That sounds like genuine learning to me, I said, and meant it. As we shared our Thanksgiving meal, the conversation flowed with an ease that had been missing for far too long. Sarah talked about her upcoming school play, Michael shared stories from work that didn't revolve around financial stress, and Janet asked for my opinion about redecorating the guest bathroom without any underlying assumption that I wouldn't be around to see the results. These were the interactions I'd been hoping for, the simple recognition that I was still a person with thoughts and preferences and contributions to make to our family's daily life. After dinner, as we worked together to clean up, Sarah made an announcement that surprised all of us. I wrote something for my English class about families, she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. Mrs. Henderson said I could read it at the school's winter program if I wanted to. Can I read it to you guys first? Of course, I said, settling into my favorite chair while the others gathered around. Sarah unfolded her paper and began to read in the clear voice of someone who'd inherited her grandmother's confidence in public speaking. My essay is called "The Family That Almost Lost Itself," she began, and I felt my breath catch slightly. This fall, my family almost made a terrible mistake. The adults were so worried about things that might happen in the future that they forgot to pay attention to what was happening right now. She looked up at us briefly before continuing. My grandmother is 72 years old, and some people think that means she's too old to make her own decisions. But I know my grandmother is the smartest, strongest person in our house. She helps me with math homework that my parents can't figure out. She grows vegetables that feed our whole family. She tells stories about history that make it seem real instead of boring. Michael and Janet exchanged glances, and I could see them recognizing their daughter's perspective on events they'd thought she wasn't paying attention to. For a while, my parents were acting like Grandma was already gone, Sarah continued. They talked about her like she wasn't in the room, made plans for her like she couldn't make her own plans, and worried about her dying so much that they forgot she was still living. The simple clarity of a 12-year-old's observation was more powerful than any adult analysis could have been. But then something changed, Sarah read. The adults started talking to each other instead of about each other. They started asking Grandma what she wanted instead of deciding what she needed. And our house started feeling like a family again instead of like people who just happened to live in the same place. She folded the paper and looked at each of us in turn. My teacher says families are about more than being related to each other. They're about choosing to love each other every day, even when it's hard. I'm proud that our family figured out how to choose love instead of fear. The silence that followed was profound, filled with recognition and gratitude, and the kind of emotional weight that comes from hearing truth spoken simply and clearly. That's beautiful, sweetheart, I said finally, my voice thick with pride and love. And very wise. Can I ask you something, Grandma? Anything. Are you planning to keep living here? Because I really hope you are. I looked around the room at these people who'd learned to see me clearly again, who'd discovered that including me in decisions produced better results than excluding me, who'd figured out how to choose love over fear. Yes, I said simply. I'm planning to keep living here for as long as everyone wants me to, and as long as I'm able to contribute to our family's happiness. Good, Sarah said with the satisfaction of someone who'd been worried about something important and was now reassured, because it wouldn't be the same without you. As evening settled over the house I'd called home for 43 years, I sat in my favorite chair watching my family navigate their evening routines with the easy cooperation we'd built over the past month. Sarah was at the kitchen table working on homework with Janet's help, while Michael loaded the dishwasher and occasionally asked questions about where things belonged. They were small changes, these gestures of inclusion and respect, but they represented something fundamental: the recognition that I was still a valuable member of this household, rather than a burden to be managed, until I could be gracefully removed. My phone rang and I smiled when I saw Margaret Foster's number on the display. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dorothy," she said when I answered. "How did the day go?" "Better than I dared to hope," I replied honestly. "I think we've figured out how to be a family again." "I'm so glad to hear that. You deserved nothing less." "Thank you for all your advice and support. I couldn't have navigated this without knowing I had someone in my corner." "You always had someone in your corner," Margaret said firmly. "You just had to remember that person was you." After we hung up, I sat quietly in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of my family settling into evening. This was what I'd been fighting for. Not just the right to make my own decisions, but the opportunity to continue being part of something larger than myself. The funeral they'd been planning would have to wait indefinitely. I had too much living left to do. Too many more Thanksgiving dinners to cook. Too many homework sessions to supervise. Too many family memories to create. I was Dorothy Chen, 72 years old, homeowner, grandmother, and active participant in my own life. I'd reclaimed my place in my family, not by demanding respect, but by demonstrating that I deserved it. And while I couldn't control how many years remained to me, I could control how I lived each day I was given. That seemed like enough. More than enough, it seemed like everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.